So we actually have a lot of, I actually know a lot of the family members because I've been working with them for so long. You know, I go back and forth to Israel all the time. It could be me, it could be any one of us on a Codell, it could, and I just do not think this is what America is all about. So and I would like to also talk a little bit about Arnold Roth, who cannot, for some reason, up here, he thought he could, but he can't. His lawyer says he can't. So, but Arnold Roth, unfortunately, had the misfortune of, in August of 2001, of letting his two daughters, Malki and Hyla, go to the Sparrow restaurant on, I think it's Ben Yehuda Street or Jaffa Street and King George Street in the middle of Jerusalem. And it was due to have been blown up by Ahmed Tamimi. Now, Ahmed Tamimi was one of those suspects or terrorists, an admitted terrorist who actually brags about it, who planned the Sparrow Pizza bombing. And we have her on tape 2 times, and many times, even more than that now. The first time was before she was released from prison in Israel. She was traded for Gilad Shalit, which is a whole other moral dilemma, which thank God I'm not the Prime Minister of Israel, I don't know what I would do. But she was traded for Gilad Shalit, and while she was still in Israel prison, somebody asked her, do you know how many Jewish children you killed? And she said, I don't know, about 3. And the interviewer said, no, 6. And this huge look of delight crossed her face, and she said, I killed 6 Jewish children, as though she had done the greatest good deed in the universe. Then we have her on tape again, talking from Jordan, where she has been welcomed like a heroine. After she was released from prison, she was welcomed to Jordan like a heroine, and there were all these parties for her. And they asked her, and she was talking about the day that she dropped suicide bomber off. And she said, when I dropped him off at the restaurant, I felt a little sorry for him, but then I said, he's going to be in heaven, with all of these virgins. And then I boarded a bus that was going back to East Jerusalem, where she lived. And she said, and I heard the bus driver talking in the Zionist tongue, meaning Hebrew. The radio announcer talking in the Zionist tongue, meaning Hebrew, and the bus driver was translating. And everybody was high-fiving. And we saw Palestinian policemen high-fiving when they heard about the act. And she said, should I take credit for it? Should I tell anybody? No, I'm going to be modest. I'm not going to take credit for it. And this is what Israel has to deal with. These are people that praise death and martyrdom. This is why Israelis right now are running today into safe rooms and bomb shelters, because this is a culture that teaches their children that the greatest thing that they could do is to attach a belt of dynamite around their waist and blow themselves up. Sherri Mandell had said to me, whose son Kobe was lost, she said to me, we take our pain and we turn it into healing and life. They take their pain and they turn it into hatred and death and more pain. And this is basically the crux of the matter. Alan Bauer is a very, very heroic man who fortunately was not killed, and his son was not killed, but they were victims of a terrorist attack on King George Street in the middle of Jerusalem. Okay, this is Alan Bauer, who actually is very heroic in his efforts to try to get justice for all of the victims of terrorism. Alan, please tell us about what happened to you and your son and your efforts to get justice as an American citizen.
Okay, thank you very much. for the opportunity to speak. My name is Alan Bauer, and I'm originally from Chicago. I have a bachelor's degree from Harvard and a PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison. I came to Israel in 1992 on a Fulbright fellowship, and in 2002, my son and I were wounded in a suicide bombing in downtown Jerusalem. The bomber was a Palestinian policeman. Everyone involved in the attack was a member of the Palestinian Authority. The head of the cell was actually a senior member of the Palestinian Intelligence Agency. It was a suicide bombing in downtown Jerusalem in which 3 people were killed, including a pregnant wife and her husband. 87 people were wounded, including the 2 of us. I had 2 screws passed through my left arm, and our oldest son, Yonatan, who was 7 at that time, had the head of a screw passed fully through his right brain. The members of the cell, other than the suicide bomber himself, obviously blew up, were arrested within a few months. They included Marwan Barghouti, who actually paid $600 for the attack. As I mentioned, the head of the cell was a captain in the intelligence agency. It would appear that the bombing material came from the Palestinian Authority Intelligence Agency, which means ultimately that it came from the U.S. government, because the U.S. government was working very closely at that time to help them set up a serious intelligence agency. So the question of our relationship with the United States government and attempts to get justice in this case is a little bit depressing, I'm afraid. The U.S. government passed in the 1990s a series of laws to allow for both criminal prosecution of people who harmed Americans overseas. This is in response to the Klinghoffer murder. And also there were civil laws allowing people like me to sue people who involved in harming us. With respect to the criminal side of things, the Department of Justice is in charge of these cases. They work closely with the FBI and the State Department because there are issues of foreign policy involved in these things. The FBI has dutifully set up a case file for every single case in which an American was killed or wounded. We're talking about over 75 files. We're talking about over 55 Americans killed and another 85 wounded. To date, the United States has not prosecuted a single Palestinian terrorist. They've never arrested one. They've never indicted one. They've never extradited one. They've never put in for an extradition request. So essentially, the United States government is 0 for 75. They do have an office. Obviously, Sarah spoke about this, the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism, OJVOT, better known as the Sherri or the Mandell office, the Kobe Mandell office. It's staffed by people who are theoretically worrying about our cases. In 2012, a group of us who had children harmed by Palestinian terrorists sent a letter to Eric Holder requesting that they do something in our cases. Eric Holder wrote back to each family and wrote a very nice letter saying these cases are so important to us, but nothing's ever happened. So what's the problem? There's several problems. The first one is the Department of Justice doesn't care. I mean, what I mean by they don't care. The burden for them to do a prosecution is enormous. As you just saw, they arrested this fellow who was apparently involved in the Benghazi murders. And the indictment is all of 15 lines long. And it claims that this guy joined this al-Qaeda group the day of the attack, and he himself didn't participate, but somehow he helped organize when things had already started. They find these cases extremely hard. Guantanamo was not opened as an extension of Disney World in Florida. Guantanamo was opened because it was realized that there are people who harm American citizens or wish to harm them, but you don't have the American standard of evidence for these people. So the U.S. treats these cases like a mugging in Central Park. They're hoping to get witnesses, they're hoping to get evidence. It's almost impossible for them to get what they need. The Israelis do not play ball. The Israelis do not like to give the FBI material, and they certainly do not share sensitive things like signal intelligence. But on the other hand, the U.S. doesn't push the issue. So in the case of the embassy bombing, which all the victims were American citizens, several, I think 3 were killed, several were injured, there was not an Israeli anywhere in sight. No one has ever been prosecuted, not by the U.S., not by Israel. So if this was a really important case for them, they'd put the screws on Israel. The U.S. has enormous levers, as we've seen Obama use, that they can push Israel if they want to. But our cases just simply don't merit that kind of attention. So the FBI and DOJ, they fly to Israel, they meet with their counterparts, they discuss these cases. but as I said, nothing has ever been done. I spoke to Greg Sother, who was the original head of the Kobe Mandell office, very nice fellow. So he said that they could try to get a prisoner in Israeli jail to testify. So I said, how do you do that? Well, we could get him a TV, or we can maybe get him a better cell. But these are things that are so far from reality, in the sense that, would that really convince a Palestinian to have his entire family killed once he shows up in a U.S. court to testify against some other, Palestinian terrorist? They did try, at least I know on 2 occasions, to get indictments. Both cases failed. In one case, they moved a guy and his family all the way to California, and when it came time to, for him to appear in front of a grand jury, he had amnesia. He didn't remember who was in the car and who killed Boaz Avraham, a 75-year-old American who was murdered in cold blood. And he was in the car when this happened, and he knew who did it, but when it came time to testify, he simply forgot. So these cases have been extremely difficult. They have not, pushed hard to get Israeli assistance, and somehow they defer to the Israelis. There's nothing in the laws that says the U.S. has to defer to anybody. Now, what they'll tell you is in places like, in Somalia and in Libya where there's no law, so they'll come in and swoop in and grab a guy. But where you have actual, laws in place in countries that have functional legal systems, they defer to those countries. There's nothing in the U.S. law that says they have to defer to anybody. And case in point is a woman who, Tamimi, who was involved in the Sparrow bombing. If you Google her or put her name into YouTube, Ahlam Tamimi, you can find dozens of videos where she talks about how she planned and executed the Sparrow bombing, which left several American citizens dead. She is sitting in Amman today as a talk show host, and she does not fear U.S. extradition. And just because she was released in the Shalit deal does not mean that she somehow has been absolved for her murdering American citizens. But the U.S. has no interest in prosecuting her. So DOJ and the FBI, you might call them like the Keystone Cops in terms of their just incomplete, inability to actually get a bad guy. The State Department is far worse. I mean, I met Sarah the first time in 2008. We were actually in a meeting where the chief legal officer of the State Department, John Bellinger, he was Condi's lawyer. He tried to convince us why the Department of State would want to file a statement of interest in favor of the PLO against an American citizen whose husband was gunned down while he was singing at a bat mitzvah. So she'd won a $175 million judgment, and they wanted to throw the judgment out because they claimed it would just bankrupt the PA and then you'd have Hamas running the place. So they were set to file a statement of interest, and after the fact, we'll do you a favor, so they met with 20 of us terror victims. It was an acrimonious 3-hour meeting. It was ugly. Threatened twice to get up and leave. In the end, they didn't file their statement of interest. There's enormous pressure from Congress to stay out of the case. It's a private civil case. There's pressure from AIPAC. There was a bad publicity, U.S. in favor of terrorists over terror victims. She had 6 orphans, this woman. So in the end, they stayed out, but it's not the first time. I mean, even just a month ago, John Kerry tried to get the Supreme Court to lay off Arab Bank. The Arab Bank was essentially the juice for the Second Intifada. They moved tens of millions of dollars to terrorist organizations from Saudi Arabia in order that they should be able to function in the Palestinian territories to kill Jews. And they are facing we're hopefully going to court next month. And so they ran to the Supreme Court begging that certain punishments, which the judge gave for the not providing millions of documents, would be thrown out. In the end, the Supreme Court refused to hear it, but John Kerry apparently lobbied the U.S. government to push the Supreme Court to hear the case and throw out the punishments. So the State Department actively hates terror victims. They wish we'd go away. They have the Rewards for Justice site, which is run by the State Department. To date, no one's gotten a reward for anything related to Israel because they've never prosecuted anyone. They have actively supported the PA over terror victims, and they would very much like for our cases. We have a civil case against the PA, which also is supposed to go to court in January. They'd like for these cases to vanish because, again, they're always worried about the stability of the PA. So, again, the problem is that the U.S., if it wants to win, we don't call the war on terror. That got thrown out as, man-made, or man-caused disasters. The long and the short is that the U.S. has to make a stand on the right side. And U.S. terror victims are, U.S. citizens, proud U.S. citizens. The law states clearly that the U.S. has an obligation to prosecute The law states clearly that we have the right to sue those who were involved in our attacks, but the U.S. government is simply out to lunch. And so it's not surprising. One can see it now with the business in Gaza, where the onus is on Israel to make sure that every bullet hits only a terrorist and nothing else. So, we have a perverse situation now. We have it also with respect to our cases where the U.S. simply does nothing. I know that when the Shalit deal went through, there were 15 terrorists who got out who had killed or maimed American citizens, including 2 in our case. And they got out, and the FBI did not know how to identify those who'd been involved in American attacks, because the fellow who had been in charge of the case files, he got a call in the middle of the night saying, how do we identify these people? We don't know how to transliterate their names. The identification numbers are incomplete. And so essentially they were caught flat-footed. And as one of our lawyers, Gary Osen, he actually had to send them a list of the 15 terrorists and which attack they were involved in and who the victims were in order for them to understand who'd gotten out. But the U.S. made no effort to keep these people in jail. They sent a pathetic letter the day before the release saying, please don't release anyone who'd harmed an American. Of course, the Israelis blew that off. And so of the 1,000 who got out in the first round, there were 15 who'd harmed Americans. In the second round, there were also several, including one from our attack as well. So it's very disconcerting as American citizens to see the U.S. not prosecute. It's disconcerting as the U.S. not even make an effort to keep these people behind Israeli bars, something I've requested, for 5 years before the release. 4.5 years before the release, I wrote emails already to, at that time it was Dan Shapiro, who was an Obama operative, saying that there's going to be a release one day. Please keep the ones who harmed Americans in jail. So even that they weren't willing to do, and certainly they won't even prosecute them. The ones who got out and the ones who were never prosecuted in the first place, the U.S. makes no serious effort to bring them to, so they always tell us that we're working on it, justice takes time. I don't know why they have to, they like this cold crime stuff. There's always things on the internet about, they cracked a 20-year-old case. I don't know why they have to, it's like wine, they have to wait 20, 50 years and then they finally go ahead and do something with it. They simply let these cases go. And the problem is these people continue to strike. It's like with the story with the World Trade Center. When they blew up the first time, some of those people had been involved in the murder of Kahana, but they didn't, the New York Police Department didn't take it seriously. So if they'd taken it more seriously, maybe they would have prevented that first attack in the parking lot of the Trade Center. But again, if you have any questions or comments, we are, as I mentioned, we're suing them. We're suing the PA and the PLO who are actively involved in our attack, providing the weapons and the logistics. The fellow who ran the cell, while in Israeli jail, not only does he get a salary like everybody else, he's moved up 3 levels in his position. If he came in as a captain, now he's a major within the Palestinian Intelligence Agency. So, they're clearly PA employees. They, Al-Aqsa took responsibility for the attack the day after the bombing. Actually, the fellow, the head of the cell, he interviewed with the New York Times. He said he did it. He sent the bomber, and he claimed it was retribution for Israel having killed his brother a couple months earlier. So, again, obviously we have a personal stake in this, but I think that the U.S. loses enormously when it doesn't stand up for its rights and doesn't show the world that it's serious about terror. And so I think that this is something that the Palestinians, no one takes the U.S. seriously anymore. But seriously, when you look at it, that they won't even follow the laws that are on the books. The Klinghoffer, was murdered, and those laws were passed for a reason. But they simply will not enforce them. They're treating it in a way that it will never work. And they don't have any, if they need more laws, they should go back to Congress, which is something they don't do. Any questions? Any comments? Yes, sir, in the back.
Oh, thank you. So you had spoken about part of the reason for the lack of action by DOJ and the State Department is the difficulty of getting the evidence necessary to prosecute and get a conviction in the U.S. court. But it's sort of the underlying issue going on here that, especially this administration, even previous administrations, were determined to advance the peace process and make the PLO and Palestinian Authority give sort of pressure Israel into giving them all the 67 territories, and therefore all these most of these terrorist attacks are sort of traced back to the Palestinian Authority in one way or another, or turning a blind eye to Hamas. Therefore they don't want to take these cases to the end because they're afraid that it'll show the Palestinian Authority itself is responsible and sort of put obstacles in the way of forcing Israel to withdraw from the territories, and they don't want to do anything that would delegitimize in any way the Palestinian Authority.
Well, it's an interesting question because, I mean, actually, as I mentioned, we have this case that, God willing, if it goes to court, it's in January. And so they filed for a summary judgment claiming that there's no evidence. And let me just quickly, the case involves 7 attacks and 11 American families. And so they claim there's no evidence. So our lawyers filed 18,400 pages of evidence and 10 hours of video. So now, some of it may not reach a U.S. standard, but, speaking to our lawyer, who is an Arthur Porter, he said that he thinks the vast majority would be acceptable for presentation in U.S. court. And one of the major concerns the Palestinians have is exactly that what you said. If we go to court, a lot of bad stuff's going to come out. A lot of, I've warned the State Department about this. There's a fellow who is the assistant ambassador. He's in Iraq now. I warned him that if our case comes, does actually go to court, they can kiss funding the PA goodbye. Because if today, with them joining Hamas, there are already voices, Rand Paul and others saying don't fund, don't fund. Once it comes out that they paid to kill Americans, that they arranged the bomb that killed an American, that they themselves knew of an attack that was, impending, I think they'll find it very, very hard. So, they always say, Fatah good, Hamas bad. But the point of fact, 60% of the attacks were Fatah-based attacks during Arafat's time. And, this fellow, the Green Prince, the son of the Hamas founder, in his book, well, he was deposed for our case. And he's told about meeting with Arafat and his father and them planning attacks together. So once that comes out, the PA is cooked. So our lawyer thinks that they'll want to settle beforehand, and that's one of the major drivers. The U.S. has a storyline. PA is a good thing. The PA is the only stabilizing thing. If the PA goes under, everything's finished here. It's unfortunately not true, but it drives U.S. policy. So yes, they'd absolutely want to keep the PA intact, even if it means running over us with a D9 tractor. They don't care. They will not help us in our cases. They've actively opposed us in different things. And, again, when they wanted to file a statement of interest against this woman, their argument was that they have to save the PA. But what about her? She lost her husband. She was bringing up these orphans. She moved back to Georgia from Israel. What about her? It didn't matter. They didn't care. So in the end, they backed down there, but it's only under enormous pressure. So, they bought into this fairy tale of the PA being this fantastic organization and being moderate. And every time they name a street after a bomber or some, a public square after someone who killed, a dozen people, it doesn't really dawn on the Americans that this is the real PA. This is what you're dealing with. So they live in a fantasy, and you can't break. And as you said, it's both administrations. It doesn't matter. It was the same under Colin Powell and Condi Rice as it was under Clinton, and now what's his name? Good old John Kerry. So I don't know what you can do, because you can put all the facts on the table, and it would not. They're going to support Hamas. They'll do nothing. They'll cut off funding, and everything will go crazy. I don't know how you can change these people. I have no idea. They're hell bent on making peace, even if it's not real peace. Instead of standing back and saying, once the Palestinians are ready, let's really make peace. They'll try to push Israel into a pretzel to accept incredibly bad conditions just so they can, smile on the White House lawn and say, look, we finally did it. What, Nixon couldn't do and what Carter couldn't do and Reagan, we finally pulled it off. But as you can see from what's going on in Gaza, it's a disaster. I mean, once they have weapons in the West Bank, shooting at, West Jerusalem and also the airport and all the rest, you can kiss things goodbye.
Right.
Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Dan
Blue.
Hi. What specifically would you like to see the Justice Department doing? You were very candid at the outset as to the difficulties involved in these prosecutions, the intimidation of the witnesses, the amnesia, the fact that there's certain other difficulties of the evidence. And you also referenced one case where it seems to be obvious and straightforward. But on the whole, what specific things would you like to see the Justice Department doing that they sort of have not done already? It sounds like they did try in 2 cases you referenced, but go ahead.
Okay, that's an excellent question. First thing I'd like them to do is shut down the Office of Justice Victims Overseas Terrorism, but they won't do that. So, the next thing is as follows. Let's say, look, there are 75 cases where Americans were either killed or injured. And let's assume that you have 3 unique terrorists for each case, because there's a lot of overlap. You might have the same shooter in a couple of cases. The guy who made the bomb made him for 3, 4. So let's say you have like 200 unique terrorists who were involved in killing or maiming American citizens, then I would think that the Justice Department could define a series of 20 of them. They could be the worst. They could be the low-hanging fruit, the easiest ones to get, and make it a point to work with Israel, Jordan, the PA, whoever it is, to get these people indicted and brought to the U.S. and tried. They don't have to be for our case. I'll bring you an example. There's an extraordinary example. There was a case, not ours, but it's a parallel case, where a bomber blew up in a pizzeria in a northern Israeli town. And several American kids were in that pizzeria. Several were killed, and others were very badly wounded. And this case has been wending its way through the federal courts for years, just like ours. Ours is 10 years old. So they got a batch of papers from the PA's lawyers, which, discovery, normal stuff. There was a document in this batch which they didn't request. And it described exactly who was involved in the attack, and it came from the Palestinian Intelligence Agency. So when they met with the lawyers, they said, well, what's this document? And they turned gray. That was an internal document which was never, ever supposed to reach the good guys' lawyers. So they demanded it back, and they demanded that every reference which should be destroyed, and they pushed, in court that they had to wipe their disks clean. And so, our lawyers said, if the U.S. government demands this document from the PA, or the senator asks for it, then the game's over. This was a list of everyone who was involved in the timetable of the attack. The U.S. never requested that document. I brought this to the attention of the FBI. I brought it to the attention of the DOJ. I wrote to several members of Congress saying, please, just, demand this document. You give a lot of money to the PA, demand it. No one would touch it. No one asked for it. So,
Alan, we have a lot of congressional staffers in the room. Could you get us the information about this document, and maybe some of their members might request it?
I would be more than happy to, it'll be, beginning next week, to try to find those details again. There's the Shatsky case. It's the Shatsky case. I'll forward them to you, and then please use them as you see fit. But again, it was something where you're telling the DOJ there's a piece of evidence. There's a piece of evidence that you can reach out and get. And if you ask for it, then the judge can't have that document destroyed. Because once the DOJ comes in, the judge will step back. They wouldn't come in. They would not come in. And I've written in the FBI, there are several videos of the women involved in our attack. There were 2 women who brought the bomber downtown to make it look less suspicious. And so they've been interviewed in jail and out of jail, since they also got up with Shalit. And I have, their videos, and I've told them, and they've never shown any interest. They've never, I gave them the address of the producer. I said you could demand from her the raw material, because I'm sure it's much more than what's actually in the video itself, where you discuss the details, the individuals, the timing, etc. They never expressed anything. So my hope, if I were to wake up, in the middle of a dream, they would take 20 people and do everything possible to get those people prosecuted. I never expect it. They'll never prosecute anybody. They don't care. It's just not worth their effort to do it. And they get to pay the same amount whether they do this or don't do it. So, the FBI, when Sarah's letter with the 51 congressional signatures hit the fan in DOJ, that caused an earthquake. There's the guy who was on the case for the FBI quit, which means he got kicked out. The guy who was before him, who was my contact, he got reassigned. And apparently, and they won't let me talk to the FBI anymore. So apparently that letter to Holder, signed by 51 members of Congress, simply caused an earthquake, because they finally got a slap in the face, a public slap in the face, the Walsh-Berman letter, saying, you guys have done nothing. Why is that the case? And apparently, since they had to put a formal response, it caused problems. So the Congress is the only body that has consistently been supportive of terror victims. They wrote the letters to Bellinger or to Condi Rice saying, stay out of the Knox case. They're the ones who wrote letters telling Holder, get off your butt and do something. So, to get the DOJ to do something, they're going to have some external pressure. My feeling, the best thing is to have a congressional hearing. There was one a few weeks ago, but it was weak, extremely, because it was focused more on the funding of PA guys in jail. But to drag Holder and Heather Cartwright and anyone between the two of them in front of the cameras and in front of Congress, why have you not prosecuted a single individual in 75 attacks? The Keystone Cops were better. Even the Three Stooges would catch a guy now and then. These guys have caught nobody. And if they're put in front of a congressional committee where they can, hem and haw why they can't get anybody, and if the Israelis aren't playing ball, why don't they push the Israelis to play ball? I think it might do the little bit to actually force them to do something. But again, I have no idea. I don't expect anything. I've given up on them. You know, they
Thanks.
don't respond to my emails, and I don't expect a thing from them.
Thanks, Alan. But we have very wonderful, intelligent, young, bright staffers here who believe in America. And what this has done is compromise the morality of America by trying, as Aaron Friedman had said and Alan had said, by trying to cover up for the murder of American citizens. Literally, by letting people get away with murder. This has compromised our morality. This has compromised everything that America is about. And we should not. I know you're frustrated. It's been years and years and years of beating your head against the wall. But some of these people work for really wonderful members of Congress who are very idealistic and still believe in America. And we're going to keep trying. All right, now.
If I could just jump in and answer to your question as well. What about Alan? That's still a case that is prosecutable. It's a slam dunk. Why don't they go after that? I mean, talk about a symbol. That's an easy case. If they went after her, they would win and should be in jail right now. They won't do it, and they should be asked about that.
She lives in Jordan. We have an extradition treaty with Jordan. There would be no complications here. If there's a will, there's a way. We are a great country. If we remember that, if we remember what we stand for, and that we're a mighty nation, we could get these people like that, but we're not using our will.
Well, I'll just make one point, Sarah. I mentioned this in the recording I sent. The FBI agent whom I met, who's been reassigned, he claimed they will not prosecute anyone the Israelis prosecute. I know of no legal basis for that behavior,
Right.
but he says it's absolutely sacred. Even if a person is found not guilty in Israel, if he faced an Israeli court of some sort, they will not prosecute him in the U.S., and I don't know why. I have no idea what it
We
is.
know that there's no double whammy
Double
double jeopardy, and there's, yeah, I'm not a lawyer, there's no double jeopardy, but I hang around with a lot of lawyers. There's no double jeopardy, and we know that there's no statute of limitations for murder. So we can do this if we wanted. All right, now we have, we're getting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. We've got to get Seth and Sherri Mandell on the phone.
Okay, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate
Okay,
it. Anyway,
thank
to be successful, and I'll pass along the material that you asked for the Shotsky case.
Excellent, thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So I spoke to you a little bit about Sherri and Seth Mandell. They are such remarkable people. They've taken the pain since their oldest son, Kobe, was killed, and they have turned it into something beautiful and healing. They have summer camps for other children who have lost siblings to terrorism. They have healing retreats for the mothers and now for the grandparents. Aside from the very, the essence of the case, which I told you before, they are extremely frustrated with the lack of justice in their son's murder. We have a room full of smart, capable staffers that want to do something. So tell us the story and tell us your dealings with the U.S. Department of Justice, okay?
Okay, now start with Kobe's murder, you mean?
Okay, yes.
Okay, so 13 years ago in 2001, May of 2001, our son Kobe, who was 13 years old, was murdered by Arab terrorists about 500 yards from our house. We live on the West Bank in a place called Tekoa, about 10 kilometers, 6 miles outside of Jerusalem. He and his friend Yosef were out exploring this canyon that starts in Jerusalem and goes past our home, and they were caught in a small cave by 4 or 5 Palestinian terrorists and beaten to death with boulders the size of bowling balls. It was a horrible crime. It was a very brutal crime. And we have what I call people, we have become people who were struck by terror, and the rest of the world calls victims of terror. We started a foundation called the Kobe Mandell Foundation, which has about 400 children who have lost immediate members to terror and tragedy. Actually, over the last course of these 3 weeks, we will go to camp for up to 10 days and have a therapeutic experience both fun therapy and social integration.
Oh, so after Kobe was killed, Sarah, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here. Okay.
So Sarah was working on a bill do you want to explain about the bill?
I did. I explained it, but you could go ahead. Just very quickly.
Okay. So it was called the Kobe Mandell Act. Sarah got it to be called the Kobe Mandell Act, which made us very pleased because Kobe would have loved that. And it passed as part of an omnibus rider. So you heard about what I explained about the moving it from the State Department to the Department of Justice.
Right.
We don't hear you now.
Yes, we do. Okay, they do know
Okay, we
that.
got you.
So
Good.
we were very excited about that, and we felt like we had a partner in the U.S. government, but that did not turn out to be true because the United States government has been very apathetic about Israeli American victims of terror. And even part of the law was that they were supposed to be in constant in communication with us. And that's been very lax. I think last year we got a communication from it's called the Office for Victims of Terrorism. We got a message from them that the case was closed, that they had decided to close the case. I'm not sure, maybe the Israelis were involved in that, but it was just a fait accompli, and it wasn't like, what do you think? Maybe it was, if you have any issues about this, please be in touch with us. But just to backtrack a little, like when Kobe was killed, the American ambassador at the time would not come to our Shiva, would not come to visit us because of where we live. And there's also, you probably know, there's a Rewards for Justice site that I think it's the Department of Justice runs, that offers millions of dollars to find terrorists who have killed American citizens abroad. And I looked on the site, Kobe's not even on the site now. His name, when you look in the index, it doesn't even appear. And I looked because of Naftali Frankel, who was murdered a few weeks ago, who is an American citizen. I was wondering if the American government would be involved in some way. And there was no mention of him on that website. So I was very distressed and disappointed. And I feel also that if the office was named originally in the name of Kobe, it's almost like an embarrassment to us because they have done so little for American victims of terror.
Just as one background point, about 10 years ago, we had a meeting with 5 or 6 FBI and other law enforcement officials who had come to Israel specifically to sort of move the agenda of the bill forward, and we met with them in our offices in Jerusalem with a number of other people who had lost children or other family members to terror, and that was really the last time we had a face-to-face meeting with them, and unfortunately there was no outcome really that happened as a result of that. We really haven't heard from them personally, perhaps maybe 3 or 4 times in the last 10 years.
All right. All right, Sherri and Seth, thanks so much. The good thing is we have some very idealistic members of Congress and some very bright, young, idealistic staffers who still believe in America, and they want to change this. And they want America to stand on the side of what's moral and what's right and what's just. So we're going to work as best we can together with them and try to harness this goodwill and be on the side of morality instead of compromising ourselves.
I want to add something because during the fight against the prison release, when they were releasing Palestinian murderers, the Israeli government, they were releasing Americans. I mean, the killers of Americans. Right. And we were in touch with not me personally, but I know somebody who was in touch with the Office of Victims for Overseas Terrorism. And it was almost like they were autistic. They did not want to have anything to do with us. They didn't want to fight a battle with the Israeli government. And they didn't want to fight for the Americans at all. They wanted to ignore it.
Right. I really feel terrible that I worked so hard and so many years trying to get this office open in Kobe's memory because it was a hollow victory and it's wasting taxpayers' dollars. And, you know, if there was a will, there was a way. We really want to hold hearings, and we want to bring Eric Holder and Heather Cartwright, who is the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Office for Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism over in the Department of Justice, and we want to ask some really, really tough questions about why 58 Americans have been killed and by Palestinian terrorists, and not one of their suspects has ever been brought to justice. Thanks so much. All right, and have a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll talk.
Sarah, I was going to say one final thing. You know, we appreciate your work so much, and I don't want you to think that that it went for naught, because Kobe would have liked nothing more than to have a bill in his name passed through Congress. Okay. So if nothing else, I want you to know that his soul in heaven was smiling down at you and the rest of us when that passed. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Shabbat Shalom.